so much for joining us today. My name is Caitlin, and I'm the Communications Manager for the Pediatric Cancer Data Commons, or PCDC. And today's event is the very first in our new guest speaker series that we're calling The Common Good. We're inviting thought leaders for this series from across the fields of oncology, clinical trials, and data sharing to talk to us about the big ideas that drive their work, with the idea that we can all learn from each other and work together toward the common good. And we're so excited to start this off today with our guest, Greg Simon. I want to note that there will be time for question and answer at the end of the talk today. So please use the Q&A function in the bottom bar of your Zoom screen to enter your questions for Greg at any time during the talk, and we'll address them at the end. And with that, I'll hand it off to pediatric oncologist and director of the PCDC, Sam Bolchenbaum.
Great, thanks, Caitlin. And big thanks to Caitlin for all the help in putting this together, her vision for this thought leadership series, and in helping us organize this event. So very appreciative of Caitlin, and for Kat Blumhardt for her help also in organizing. So thanks for tuning in today as we turn our attention toward the topic of cancer clinical trials. Since I last introduced Greg Simon for a meeting in 2019, the perception of clinical trials has changed tremendously. The whole world tracked clinical trials for the lightning fast COVID vaccines. And then we watched in horror as almost half of the American public refused to take them. They didn't trust the science. They didn't trust the clinical trials process. They didn't believe corporations or the government when they said the vaccine was safe and effective. The last 2 years have been more challenging than we could have ever predicted. The Cancer Moonshot was launched with ambitious annual milestones without ever knowing what 2019 would bring. Our own Pediatric Cancer Data Commons group has been very lucky. Being digital, switching to remote work has been very smooth for us, and we've had no interruptions in our work. And on paper, kids with cancer have fared pretty well during COVID. In fact, it seems like admissions for fevers, often due to everyday viruses, have declined because of all the COVID precautions. However, as we saw with so many parts of the pandemic, the social isolation was horrible. In the past, children could have their parents, friends, and relatives close by while they were in the hospital. This support line was suddenly cut off. Kids who were in for weeks or even months after a stem cell transplant were allowed to only have one caregiver by their side who could not leave the hospital or even trade off with anybody else. The result was frustrated and sad children and exasperated parents. This was a situation that not even Zoom could fix. Greg Simon has talked about the inconvenience of traveling for in-person clinical trials visits. And in that respect, the world has changed for the better. It's now an accepted fact that studies can often be performed remotely. It took a pandemic to make this change, and hopefully we'll never go back. So today, Greg's going to share with us his unique perspectives into these and other critical issues. The professional history of Greg Simon is difficult to summarize because it's vast and varied and starts over 20 years ago. He served in senior positions in both chambers of Congress and was chief domestic policy advisor to Vice President Al Gore. At Pfizer, he served as senior vice president of worldwide policy and public engagement. And although he has the ear of leadership, he still understands the frustrations that regular patients feel. As a cancer survivor, Greg can combine the patient perspective with the scientific perspective because he lives on both sides. When I last saw Greg 2 years ago, he was in the midst of the Cancer Moonshot, an initiative led by President Biden. As executive director, Greg led a coalition that embarked on the nearly impossible charter of getting competing cancer organizations to share what they know about cancer, share genomic data, share research data, share information about clinical trials. We can call it open source cancer, an environment where there is no secret sauce, no competing interests, just an audacious plan to stop over 8 million people from dying from cancer every year. The messages about sharing cancer data and COVID prevention and treatment are not that different. How are we doing with global access to vaccines and access to cancer care? We must work for cancer and COVID treatments to reach the farthest corners of the earth. Because despite all of our technical advances with cancer, the average child on this planet who dies from cancer was never diagnosed in the first place. Think about that for a second. Impoverished patients have no access to care. So today we come together to solve the world's toughest problems. As scientists, our responsibilities have never been greater. We must work to deliver medicines faster than ever before. We must work to educate the public and fight misinformation. And most importantly, we must share our innovations with our peers around the globe. We have to pull together and do what's best for all of humanity. We can't leave half the world behind. The pandemic turned the world upside down, and today we look to Greg Simon and all of his wisdom to make sense of it. Thank you. Greg?
Thank you, Sam. And thank you for the incredible work you're doing at the Pediatric Data Cancer Commons. I seem to make a living out of talking to people who are a lot more educated about the topic than I am. So forgive me if I don't know as much as all of you do about pediatric cancer trials. And I want to talk today first, there's the old joke of the rabbi who says, before I speak, I'd like to say a few things. And that's what I would like to do right now, because I think it's really important to talk, before I get to the topic, to talk about the moment. And that moment is what's happened to us with COVID. So anybody who knows me knows that I don't give speeches in a straight line from A to Z. So pardon me if I go a little off topic, but it's hard to talk about anything without looking at the overall context of where we are in COVID as a country and as a world. And unfortunately, the story starts with the whole country being lied to about the prevalence of COVID in the world and the fact that it was heading to the United States. Imagine if Franklin Roosevelt had hidden the attack on Pearl Harbor because it would upset people. Well, people whose children are affected by childhood cancers don't want to be lied to. They don't want to be babied. They want to be told the truth. And unfortunately, that did not happen with COVID. And as a result, we started our response to COVID far later than we should have. That led to hundreds of thousands of deaths. We cannot forget that. We cannot ignore that. And as Sam said, the powerful statistic of how many children die from pediatric cancers who are never even diagnosed tells us that we have so much more to do to think that we're making any progress in childhood diseases. The response to COVID scientifically followed the normal approach, which is, how do we develop a vaccine to this virus? How do we develop therapies to this virus? And unfortunately, we have trained the American people not to trust in science. And when I say we, that's not exactly accurate, because it wasn't all of us who did that. In the last administration, it was a concerted effort to confuse people about the response to COVID so that people were taking horse tranquilizers and things that don't work when we knew what could work. And we were doing clinical trials and vaccine development at a pace that was unimaginable at any time in our past. So we first have to be honest about the fact that all of the awful things that happened with COVID, many of them could have been avoided. And we cannot let this happen again. And we can't let this happen in our regular everyday health either. We should be shocked that so many people do not believe in the vaccines. We should be ashamed at how many people don't care about the health of their neighbors. Every time I talk to pediatric groups, I want to point out that for me, the definition of empathy is to care for other people's children. Evolution gives us all the chemical stimuli we need to care for our own children. But it is an act of empathy to care for other people's children. This is especially brought home to me this year because my wife and I have our first grandchild, a healthy boy born to my son and his wife. And when I go see Charlie, the usual joke is grandparents can hold the child until it starts crying or needing a diaper change and then hand it back. And that's the joy of being a grandparent. But I see it a little differently. It's funny how first-time parents think a baby crying is an emergency. If there's no visible pain and the diaper's clean, a child crying is just communicating with the world and basically expressing himself. So I eagerly hold our grandson and let him cry until he's done, and hold him to just let him know that we are there and we will always be there, and he is loved and he is surrounded. At the same time, I'm visiting my 98-year-old mother, who is physically pretty healthy, takes no medicines, does not have Alzheimer's, but she does have about a 10-minute memory cycle at this point in her life. And that means she can't remember the last time I visited. She can't remember holding her great-grandson, even though there's a picture of her holding him in her room. So when my mother looks at me with the same sort of anxiety that Charlie does, all I can do is hold her and let her know that it's going to be okay and we're there for her. The blessing of a short memory is that she does not remember that we could not visit her at all during 2020. We could not touch her. We could not hug her. And it's a blessing, actually, that she doesn't remember the isolation she went through in 2020. And why do I bring this up? Well, I bring this up because I had a very meaningful conversation with my daughter, who's 29 years old, a few weeks ago. And I told her, of all the things in your life, there's one reason why we exist on this planet. And that reason is love. We exist to love each other and the planet and everything in it. And that, to me, is the definition of empathy. We're here to love each other. We're not here to make a lot of money. We're not here to live in a nice house. We're not here even to have a career. We're here because we are living organisms who can feel and express ourselves. And the highest form of expression is love. And love means empathy. And that is why it's so important what you're doing to help other people's children, and in many sad cases, your own children, to survive pediatric diseases, especially cancer. And the opposite of love isn't hate, it's apathy. And that is what I fear after the previous political world, that we have been taught to be apathetic to children separated at the border, to elderly people suffering in living facilities and assisted living facilities. And we have become apathetic about the fate of people who don't look like we do. And that's why I bring all this up, because we cannot succeed in healthcare. We cannot succeed in pediatric care unless it is driven and motivated by empathy and by love. And that is what I want to talk to you about today and tie it to the topic of clinical trials. In the moonshot, we focused on collaboration, data sharing, putting patients at the center, and doing what you could do to double our progress against all kinds of cancer now, not a year from now, not after 3 more grants, but what you could do today. And that is the same agenda that we had at the Biden Cancer Initiative in 2017 to 2019, when we had to close the initiative down because Vice President Biden then was running for president. And sadly, in our society, politics made it impossible for us to continue as a cancer organization without being accused of being a backdoor into the Biden administration. That was a tragedy. There were a lot of tears the day we had to close the Biden Cancer Initiative. And I'm proud to say that all of my wonderful staff, each of them went on to run an organization for the first time. And I couldn't be prouder of that. But what the moonshot taught us was that if you ask the public to be involved in the fight against cancer, not just a spectator, they will respond in ways that you could never have asked of them. They will respond in ways you could never have anticipated. And in many cases, faster, better, and smarter than we could ever have planned from one location in the White House. So I want to talk to you today about where we are now with COVID and clinical trials in cancer. We all know that COVID is going to take a bite out of academic achievement for the children who missed a year of school, basically. But it's also going to take a lot of lives out of our country of people who did not get screened, people who did not get treated, people who did not get any kind of cancer detection for cancers that we can cure. And then there are the cancers that we can't. If we're going to deal with the thousands of forms of cancer, not to mention the 7,000 diseases for which we have no treatments at all, not just cancer diseases, we're going to have to change everything about the way we approach therapeutic development and clinical trials. Now, I wonder, the part about being on Zoom and not in person is I can't ask you questions and get an answer. You can ask me questions later. But I don't know how many of you know who Jon Snow is. And I don't mean Jon Snow from Game of Thrones. I mean Jon Snow, the Englishman, who was the developer of chloroform back in I believe it was the late 18th century and early 19th century. And Jon Snow was puzzled by the fact that 500 people had died from cholera in one neighborhood in London. So he went to the city fathers after he observed a really important thing. He was a teetotaler. He campaigned against alcohol, but he noticed that one employer in this area where 500 people had died of cholera paid his workers in beer, not water. So they drank beer, not water, and none of them died. So he went to the city fathers and said, it's the water that's killing people. And they said, no, it's God. And he said, no, it's the water. And they said, no, it's God. So he knew he was going to lose that fight. So what did he do? He went to the water pump in that part of London and took out the handle. And you can see that pump today in London. And it saved thousands of lives because they couldn't use that water from that poison well, and proved him right that it was polluted water that causes cholera, something that's commonly known today, but at the time they all attributed it to a higher power. Well, today we have a lot of pumps that are pumping out the wrong kind of things for us to make progress. One of those pumps is the way we do clinical trials. We take way too long to design them. We don't include patients in those discussions. We take way too long to recruit people because we haven't talked to patients before we started the trial. We have a process that centralizes trials in big cities and big institutions that disadvantages millions of people. And those who can be in the trials often have to quit their jobs, spend their savings just to get to the trial without any hope at all that they're even getting the active drug compared to the placebo or that the drug will work. So they have to risk everything while the system is doing what is easiest for the system. Another pump we have that holds back progress is the way we publish data. I can't tell you how many articles I looked up to do this talk that I had no access to because I don't subscribe to a score of journals that cost thousands of dollars a year. This was something we took on head on in the moonshot. And all cancer moonshot funded grants have to be published in open journals. But it is still the exception, not the rule. And it is a scandal that you have to pay your taxes for NIH to fund a study that you can't read unless you pay thousands of dollars for a subscription. I thought we had made a lot of progress on that. We have a long way to go. And another pump is tenure and the entire academic system. Now, I know I'm talking to people at the University of Chicago, one of my favorite places, but it is still true that the major thing that drives people in their work at universities is to achieve tenure. And that means you have to go along to get along. And that means you don't risk failure. You don't take too many chances. You don't work with other institutions outside yours. and you try to publish as much as you can, not necessarily what is most important, which is what is making an impact. The reason I love the Pediatric Data Cancer Commons is because you are breaking the mold in all of these areas. It was not an easy thing to set up a commons for data, either the Global Data Commons at University of Chicago for all cancer data, or the Pediatric Commons. This was against the grain of how everybody does work in healthcare, and it has to change. They need to follow your lead. And then the final pump that we need to take the handle from is the whole way we focus on institution building. And by that, I mean the way we run our national institutions that fund and review all of the work in all of the diseases that we address. And I'll give you a lot more on that in a minute, but I think you all know what I'm talking about. One thing about COVID is, if there were any problems before COVID in your organization, in your university, in your institution, those cracks became chasms as a result of COVID. And that's what we have to address. We cannot ignore the cracks that have now become chasms, because the chasm may be narrowing as things go back to normal. And we don't even know what normal means anymore, or how long it will last, because we've been wrong before about the COVID virus, and we will probably be wrong again. So what are the pumps that we need to put healthy water into the system, so to speak? Well, I can't believe I'm saying this, because I've been saying it for nearly 20 years, but we have to put patients first. How many years do we have to say that before pharmaceutical companies, the NIH, the NCI, and universities put patients at the center of their agenda in researching diseases? And by that, I mean, what are the unmet needs patients care about? What are the side effects patients are willing to accept or want to avoid? You know, this year, I was so excited to meet a group that was developing a therapy to treat mucositis that comes as a result of radiation and chemotherapy, and makes life totally painful. You cannot even swallow without incredible pain. In my entire life, there's been nothing to treat it but ice chips. And finally, a company is working on a product that could relieve cancer patients' pain. So how do we put patients first? We have to talk to them. We can't just look at their claims data and their Fitbit and their Apple Watch and think that we know them. We have to actually talk to them and find out if those 10,000 steps that we measure were walking the dog or contemplating committing suicide. You cannot assume from raw data without actually talking to the person behind the data what is going on. And yet, all the data companies that tell you they can monitor everything patients do, hardly any of them, I know of one, actually talk to the patients behind the data. So putting people first is not putting their Fitbit first. It's putting them first. And that is hard to do. But what's the alternative? The second thing that we have to do is really respect the way people responded to COVID, which is the whole point of my talk. The future was brought to the present 10 years early. Are we really going to let people start going back to centralized, institutional-based clinical trials and care instead of doing what we've been doing, which is distributed virtual care? The people I talk to in the pediatric community say there is a real danger that now people can be in person again, that we will go back to the old system. When in fact, the responses to COVID in virtual care and in virtual clinical trials was enormously helpful, was astounding, was impressive, it was innovative. There really is no reason why anybody has to travel from one big city to another, or from one small town to a big city to get an infusion or to be monitored, when there are places all over the country that can do that. And we have the ability, through all of the technology we're using right now, to train people to monitor them, to audit them, and to make sure they're following all the protocols and the scientific method without them having to commute to the doctor. A friend of mine is treating a very famous person who's at Walter Reed Hospital. And they wanted this person to come from his home to the hospital nearly every day for treatments and blood work. And my friend told them, no, you're not going to ask a 90-year-old man to go to you every day. You're going to go to him. And they did. All because one person asked them to. Well, we all have to start raising our hand and saying, no, I'm not going to go to you. You're going to come to me. I'm the one in pain. I'm the one who's in the bed. Don't put the burden on the patient. You would think it would be obvious enough, but the fact that I'm telling you I've been asking this question for 20 years should let you know it's not that easy. Because unfortunately, medical research, and especially academic research, is like memory metal. You can bend it and shape it all you want, but at the first opportunity, it snaps back to the same shape it's been in since World War II. The other thing we have to appreciate is that we are on the verge of an incredible change in the way we do all medical research. The advent of artificial intelligence, the DeepMind project that made the structure of nearly every known protein available to researchers for the first time in history, something that would have taken several lifetimes for human beings to do, is going to change everything about the way we design drugs, the way we research therapies, and the way we analyze diseases. We no longer have to guess. We no longer have to do trial and error that could last as long as the universe. The DeepMind project, releasing the protein structure of millions of proteins, is probably the greatest unknown progress in the history of our modern science, even more than the Human Genome Project. That is going to change everything. But will people notice? Will universities notice? Will the NIH notice? Will they start funding new, riskier research based on these new technologies? Or are people going to keep doing what they're doing? You know, when the NIH doubled the budget during the Clinton administration, they just gave the same people more money. They didn't double the number of people who got grants. They didn't become more diverse. They didn't take more risks. They gave the same people more money. Some people asked one of the directors at the NIH in one of the mental health areas how he was going to change his approach. And his answer famously was, or infamously, why would I change our approach? So yes, I am anxious that we're at the verge of an incredible progress. We're on the verge of creating an entirely new paradigm for how we cure diseases. And yet our system is stuck in the 50s. And that is what we've got to change. So how do we deal with this in the clinical trial space, and especially with children? Well, I asked a few cancer center directors, what would you change about the way things are going in pediatric cancer trials? I was shocked that the answer was, let us do them. I had no, well, I said, what do you mean, let us do them? He said, everybody's in favor of pediatric trials, but the moment you start talking about enrolling young children in trials, people want to slow you down and stop. He said, I see this all the time. We have all these protections built in. Many of these children are terminally ill if we don't help them. And yet we have all of these roadblocks to starting trials with young children. So the lesson I learned from that was we still are not fully committed to doing pediatric trials. We have to be fully committed. We have to trust in our protections for these children. We have to make sure families trust in our protections for these children. And as we all know, families will do whatever it takes to help their children and other people's children survive childhood diseases. And it doesn't stop with surviving the disease. Children who suffer major diseases in their infancy or in their early adolescence are likely to face at least 2 other life-threatening conditions by the time they're 35. Think about that. And yet, it wasn't until Obamacare that we were able to provide insurance for young people to be on their parents' insurance, and for people in Medicaid to have expanded opportunity for healthcare. But every life we save in pediatric cancer trials is a life that's still at risk. And we have to continue the care for that child into their young adulthood. And dare I say it, into their elder years as well. We tend to ignore the consequences of childhood diseases and let them be on their own the rest of their lives, when in fact they are at risk for the rest of their lives. Even I, as a leukemia patient, know that even though I was diagnosed in my 60s, it will cause me complications the rest of my life that I have to be mindful of and protective for. Imagine if you had to have that mindset when you're 10 or 11. That's one of our challenges. So when I talk about institution building, what I'm talking about is, when are our national institutions going to take seriously the fact that we lose 1,800 people a day to cancer? We lose a year of COVID patients to cancer and more, and yet it is just viewed as a background frequency. We think that we're doing a lot of work on cancer because we spend $5 billion a year at the NCI. That's nowhere near enough. But even more than not being enough, the way we're spending it is not enough. The way we're doing things is not enough. So let me be very specific. The average age of the directors of the NIH is over 70, and they are almost all white men. There are no Asian American directors at the NIH. There are very few branch chiefs who are African American at the NIH. Their funding for years has gone primarily to white men at major institutions. Now they say that this is changing, but how long does it take to start finding new blood and new people to run these institutions who have been schooled their whole life in computer technologies and machine learning, in artificial intelligence, in coding, and a whole new way of thinking? And yet the NIH keeps going along at its own pace. I have known Francis Collins since 1992, when he came to the Clinton-Gore transition office to see if he still had a job, because he had been hired by the Bush Senior administration. Now, I knew of his work with cystic fibrosis, so I said, Dr. Collins, of course you have a job. This was at a time when a change of party didn't mean a change of direction for everything. We wanted Francis Collins to continue to be the head of the NIH, or at that time, the Human Genome Project, and then the head of the NIH. But his resignation is a bellwether moment. We had the opportunity to enliven and transform the NIH. Will we do it? Will we do it? Will we bring in somebody who's disruptive, who's innovative, who looks different, and who thinks differently? I hope we do. And the National Cancer Institute has been sort of a passive player during the COVID time. During the HIV crisis, NCI stepped up and started a vaccine program. During the COVID crisis, it was basically missing in action. Why do we have these standing institutions if they're not able to move quickly with all their money and all their people? And I go back to what I said earlier. It's because the focus is on tenure and publication. Tenure, meaning to become a part of the intramural program at the NIH, where you don't have to compete for grants. You can do what you want at the pace you want. And the worst thing that can happen to you is your paper doesn't get published. That's just not acceptable. I'm not real popular when I say that. I have a lot of friends who work in the intramural program. I live a home run from the NIH campus. But I'm telling you, as a leukemia patient and as a human being, we have to do a better job. We have to energize the NIH and the NCI to stop doing business as usual and start being leaders in disrupting our process and creating one appropriate to the 21st century. One example of that is the program that Biden has proposed, the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health, which would be like DARPA. DARPA is a Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency that developed the internet, that developed the stealth bomber. If you want to develop anti-gravity boots, you don't go to the Pentagon, you don't go to the NIH, you go to DARPA, and they take it seriously. People work there for 2 years and they're out. They design solutions, and that's what we need in health. Now, ARPA, for political reasons, is likely to be based inside the NIH. But I and other like-minded people have been telling the White House, you can put it in a closet if you want to, but it has to be independent. It has to report to somebody other than the NIH director. Its money cannot go to the NIH if it's unspent. It cannot focus on specific diseases, but on platforms that affect all diseases, like nanotechnology, cell therapy, gene therapy, AI, machine learning. This is crucial. This is going on in China. This is going on in Russia. Are we going to let this opportunity slip because we don't want to disrupt the NIH process and the thousands of researchers who rely on that process in academia? If we don't disrupt and change, we will become fossilized and we will fail. And we will fail the people we're trying to save. I don't mind if an institution fails, but I mind if its failure means the loss of millions of lives because we didn't move fast enough. All of us know people who died a year before a solution was found for their disease. One of my best friends died of multiple myeloma 3 years after diagnosis. And he tried CAR T therapy, but he wasn't allowed to because at the time when he needed it, CAR T therapy was killing multiple myeloma patients. Literally a year later, they figured out how to do CAR T therapy for multiple myeloma patients. That is why I started Faster Cures with Mike Milken, to save lives by saving time. If my leukemia had occurred 20 years ago, I might not be here. We cannot accept that. And yet, you will not find that sense of urgency on the NIH campus or the NCI campus. And that is a shame. And that is where COVID tells us you have to act with dispatch to anticipate what's going to happen. You cannot work 9 to 5. You cannot keep all the 30 and 40-year-olds as lab slaves without letting them try their ideas, without letting them fail at their ideas. We have got to be braver. We have got to be braver. The FDA did a remarkable job in COVID, despite the fact that they were being dragged around by the former president and forced to listen to things like taking bleach inside your body or using hydroxychloroquine to cure COVID. They kept their focus. They did Operation Warp Speed. They developed what they had to do for the vaccines, but even they can go faster. Even they can schedule reviews faster. Even their advisory committees can stop grandstanding and do things faster. And remember that in the middle of a pandemic, arguing about whether a 13-year-old or a 14-year-old should get a booster shot or a vaccine is not productive. This was one of those problems you could treat with a blunt sledgehammer, not a scalpel. And that sledgehammer was every vaccine for everybody, go get them as fast as possible. Now, I, as a leukemia patient, did not respond to the Pfizer vaccines or the Johnson & Johnson vaccines. And I have been urging the FDA to approve monoclonal antibodies therapies as prevention for the millions of people like me, including children, who cannot develop antibodies to vaccines. Because I'm taking a drug that kills white cells, it makes it really hard to do. They can do a better job as well, but Be nice if we gave them the money to do that and put a commissioner in place permanently to guide the agency. And the same with CMS. How can we make progress in clinical trials and pediatric cancer if they continue not to reimburse diagnostics and genetic testing to find out what we can do early in a disease to catch it and to treat it? The argument that, well, we'll waste a lot of money because these diagnostic tests may not be accurate yet. We have got to waste some money so that we find out what works and what doesn't. Far better to test too many people than too few. You would think that's a simple corollary, but apparently it's not. And we all have to work to urge CMS to err on the side of over-testing so that we can develop biomarkers and proteomic markers faster and more reliably. Now, one last point. I understand that the pediatric population in cancer is a small number of people, but the number of life years that are affected by saving those children is enormous. People my age, maybe I have 20 years left, God willing, but people my age get most of the attention. That's not a good system. We need to focus on the first 3 years of life, number one, as the most important time to intervene in humanity. And secondly, we need to focus on the fact that even though they're small in number, what we do for our children and other people's children will define us as a society. The way we treat the elderly, like my mother, also defines us as a society. They are equally helpless. They need us to care. They need our interventions. And in that regard, when I look back at my work at Faster Cures, the Melanoma Research Alliance, the Cancer Moonshot, the Biden Cancer Initiative, I'm proud of all the people I worked with. I'm proud of the things that we did, but I am embarrassed at how little progress we made in racial justice. It was always a tenet, a pillar of our work, always. But I realize now that it needed to be the central pillar of our work, even in small, quote unquote, populations like we have in pediatric cancer. Because as Sam said, think of the millions of children around the world, especially in Africa and in parts of Asia and in South America, who never get diagnosed, never get treated, never are the focus of a therapy or a trial. Racial justice is the premier calling of our time. We can make medical breakthroughs every day. We can change the world through science. But if we don't make those improvements and those therapies available to everybody, then we will have failed. And by everybody, I mean non-white, non-well-off people in the world. Not be choosing by zip code who lives and dies, not be choosing by the color of our skin. I would like to say that we have made progress in this area, but I can't. And everywhere I go, when I see the pushback about even talking about racism in our schools, I am a son of the South. I grew up in the Delta of Arkansas. I know what racism looks like. I thought I had moved past it. But when I look at the world today, and I look at the built-in racism in our institutions, not because people are venal, but because they assume that everything is okay. They assume they're doing the right thing. But when you look inside the hood, you can see how disadvantaged minority populations are in our society and around the world. And it will not get better by erosion or by death of one generation and the rising of the next. We have to fight for racial justice in healthcare every day and not assume that any progress we make will be permanent. That's the mistake I made. I thought that the progress we made in my life in the 60s and the 70s was permanent. And we can see it every day in the paper that it's not. So I urge you in your work, I don't care how small your operation is, how big your operation is, I urge you, put racial justice at the center of your agenda. I beg you. I wish I knew how to do it. I'm not that smart. And as one smart person said, no matter how smart you are, there are smarter people everywhere else. And it is our goal to connect with those people, which is why I go back to my opening point. Your work in developing the data commons, your work in reaching outside the University of Chicago to the global community, your work in connecting people who care about children and cancer to work together and not competitively, but collaboratively is crucial to the health of our future generations. And on behalf of Charlie, I want to thank you. Thank you very much.
Greg, thank you. I mean, as expected, that was a lot of ups and downs and emotion in that talk, and I really appreciate it because I think that kind of those kind of pointed criticisms are exactly what the field needs to hear, and it's what we need to be thinking about. And you brought out the issue of tenure, which I think is incredibly important. I think we have this incredibly old system that encourages data silos. It discourages sharing. And I have seen, as you have, data sit in databases for years, waiting for some paper to get published before it'll be released. I wanted, and I think that's an ongoing problem, but it made me think of another problem or another issue is a lot of my really smart and talented friends are leaving academia, and they're being, in essence, bought up by pharmaceutical companies. And I think that while there may be this brain drain from academics, the pharmaceutical companies must bear some responsibility to do the same type of sharing and the same type of open access. And since you've spent much of your career rallying on this, I'm interested in your viewpoint in what are the sticks and carrots going to be for pharmaceutical companies to develop commons, to develop ways of sharing data?
Great question. And there are also some questions I saw about pricing, which I'm happy to go into. So when I was at Pfizer for 2.5 years, let's just say I was an outlier. And one of the things that struck me was their lack of willingness to outsource, license out drugs they were not using. Why is that? Well, somebody out-licensed a drug to Pfizer that became Viagra. So from their perspective, they're worried that, oh my gosh, we're not doing anything with this drug, but we don't want anybody else to do anything with it either, which is perverse. Take the opposite approach, which is more of a game theory approach. If you license one of your thousands of unused compounds to somebody else, and it becomes a successful drug, it raises the value of all your other compounds immediately because you developed those compounds, you isolated them, identified them, characterized them, maybe even did a safety profile. And as a result, people can be saved. I'm sure you're familiar with a company that I'm an advisor to, full disclosure, Day One Therapeutics, whose whole premise is to in-license drugs that pharma is ignoring that have a safety profile that could be useful in pediatric rare diseases. And they're very first product.
Sam Blackman is on this call, and he's going to be one of our next speakers. Just wanted to stick that in there.
Super. Hi, Sam. So that is, the poster child, pardon the pun, for the value that we can have if we share data. Now, some of the pharma companies are being much better at that, but pharma, if you talk about retrenchment, whenever they take chances like this, if anything goes wrong, they immediately snap back to their old position. So you have to be constantly vigilant and constantly advocating to them. If you're not doing it, let us do it. We'll make you money. If that's what you're worried about, we'll take the risk. And by the way, it's too long to go into in this call, but one of the things I'm working on is to create a healthcare futures market. We trade wheat, we trade cotton, we trade oil, we trade pork bellies in the future for price stability and supply stability. Well, pharma companies can reduce their exposure to the risk of drug development by sharing that exposure with the markets and letting people, just like when there's oil companies don't drill oil wells with their money, they drill it with their customers' money, and then they sell it to them. Pharma could do that too, but what they do instead is they use their own money, then they charge a really high price because they're afraid that somebody will come up with a better idea. We have got to revamp the financial system under the pharmaceutical industry from top to bottom, because right now it is mutual assured destruction. Pharma prices high because they're worried about the future. Insurance companies charge high premiums and delay access to drugs because they're worried about the next quarter. Both of those positions are perverse. They have to change.
I think we have time for maybe just one more question. And this is from Susie Burrs, who's on our team, and it relates to late effects. We do a terrible job in general of getting people to keep giving us data after they're cured from their cancer. And we need to think about how can we socialize a new system where a 13-year-old with Hodgkin lymphoma, when they're 30, still care about giving data back so we can get their late effects. And I'm sure you've thought about this as a survivor as well. How can we help? Everyone involved to share more data, even when they're 20 years out from their cancer?
Well, it's, it would be nice if people adopted the attitude that that is good for them to share their data rather than viewing it as competition. The entire premise of the internet that was different from previous media networks is that the more you share, the bigger it gets, the more valuable it gets. Metcalfe's law, which most people don't know, they know Moore's law, that computing power doubles every year and drops in price by half. Metcalfe's law is the power of a network grows exponentially with the number of people using it. So you keep your data to yourself, you are depriving yourself of an exponential return.
Yeah.
So that's number one. And number two, I have always advocated, and pardon this is serious, but it's a lighthearted. Everybody knows what fantasy football is. You don't bet on the team, you bet on the player. Our health insurance system is focused on the health insurance company. How's United doing? How's their patient population affecting their quarterly returns? I would like every human being to have a baseball card. On the back of it is their health statistics as a child, as an adolescent, as a middle-aged adult, and as an elderly. And you follow their health, and insurance companies get paid if you improve, and they pay penalties if they don't improve. So we have a all of life approach, not just pediatrics, just elderly, and all the rest. So that's a long way from happening, but I'm sure there are people who will eventually figure this out.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think we need to figure out this concept of patients owning and taking more responsibility for their own data, because I think that's what's ultimately going to make the big difference here.
Absolutely. And I applaud people like citizen.com and others who have made it easy for people to get their medical records and then easy to connect to a trial. And I'm an advisor to them as well. And I couldn't be prouder that you can find a cancer trial match within 5 minutes on their site in English, in your geography. So there is progress, but it is not evenly distributed.
Yeah, totally agree. Listen, Greg, this was amazing for us. As a Pediatric Cancer Data Commons, we are indebted to folks like you who keep pushing these agendas and helping make our work more of a reality. So we're very grateful. To your point earlier, Sam Blackman from Day One Pharmaceuticals is going to be giving this talk on January 25th at the same time, 11 o'clock Central. We'll be sending out lots of information about that talk. And Greg was very, very generous in putting his email in the chat there. So I think you can expect a lot of communication, Greg. And with your permission, we're going to post this on our website, so it'll be available for others to watch. And listen, it was just incredibly exciting to have you here, and we're so grateful for all the work that you've done and are going to be doing. And we hope that we can keep in touch and maybe have you back in a year or two for an update.
It has been my honor, Sam. I can't thank you all enough.